Hello and welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive with the Rhode Island Coalition for Israel, or RICI for short. This is produced on the Ocean State Current, and it's a bold exploration of the issues shaping Israel, America, Rhode Island, and the future of Western civilization. It's hosted by me, Maria Friedman, the Executive Director of RICI, an organization of Christians and Jews that work to combat anti-Semitism and promote Judeo-Christian values. This podcast brings clarity to complex topics so that our viewers have the knowledge and confidence to engage in informed discussions. We expand the conversation beyond headlines. Rooted in Judeo-Christian or Western democratic values, this podcast showcases the grassroots partnership between Jews and Christians working together to combat anti-Semitism and confront the BDS movement through education and advocacy. We lead candid conversations that challenge false narratives and provide accurate historical, moral, and strategic context. From community voices to national thought leaders, this program amplifies perspectives often overlooked. Deep Dive delivers news and views designed to turn the tide in Rhode Island and beyond. It's a pleasure to have you all on today. I am so excited to welcome our special guest, Dr. Andrew Pessin. I've had the pleasure of working with him closely over the years, and he is a nationally acclaimed author and expert on anti-Semitism. He's written several books and articles about this topic throughout his career. He's also currently a professor at Connecticut College, and he recently just founded the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Andrew Pessin, who will begin by presenting some information to you all. He has a lot of information and knowledge to share. And throughout the presentation, please put your questions in the chat. There is a Q&A feature, and at the end, we will be asking some of your questions directly to Dr. Andrew Pessin and try to get through as many as we can. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Maria, thank you so much. Can you see the screen share? You see the
Yes,
slide?
it looks great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much to RICI. In my view, we're in an existential moment. We need all hands on deck. It's a multi-front war. I'm doing what I do largely on the campus situation, but organizations like RICI truly are boots on the ground, as they like to put it in their slogan. And so everyone should support RICI. Find their donation link, send them a few dollars, please. They show up, they turn up, and they're present, and they're absolutely essential. So thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure. You should see on the screen, this is my contact information, or if you want to follow me. I have become, didn't really choose this, but it chose me, one of the people who really focuses on campus anti-Zionism, campus anti-Semitism. We'll talk about that distinction in a little bit. And so if you're interested in that issue, please follow me on X. I have a free Substack called Pariah, but the truth ain't a democracy. There's the address for it there. I've also been running a Facebook group long before it was cool to run such a Facebook group, called Anti-Zionism on Campus. So if you are on Facebook, please come join us there. And there, of course, is my website if you want to find out more about me and my work. I should also mention, I will talk a little bit later, Maria mentioned that I've just launched the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism, and I'm looking for collaborators, colleagues, supporters, anything you want to contribute to it, or if you just want to follow it. I'll give you information about how to do that a little bit later on. The Institute is actually launching with a free webinar series. It's really going to be, I think, groundbreaking and mind-blowing. The first webinar in the series is coming up, and that is Professor Dr. Richard Landis. You see there, that's coming up next Sunday at 12 noon Eastern Time. The lecture is called The Great Lethal Projection, Anti-Zionism's Debt to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. There's the registration link. I know that that's long, but if you have trouble finding it, then just follow me on X or come to my Substack, and you'll get the link that way. This will be the first of a 6-part series. I have 6 different scholars who will be giving really the foundation of the study of anti-Zionism, and this series and the work of this institute will examine the origin, evolution, and contemporary manifestations of anti-Zionism. So begins at the beginning of the modern era with this famous book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So check it out if you can. It would be great to have you there, and please do spread the word. I thought I would first talk briefly about my background beyond that wonderful introduction that Maria gave. The historian Gil Troy has coined the phrase a Herzl moment, and he says that every Jew eventually has a Herzl moment, and the Herzl moment, Herzl's Herzl moment, of course, Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political anti-Zionism, his Herzl moment, famously, was witnessing the aftermath of the Dreyfus trial in France and suddenly coming to the conclusion that there was no future for Jews in Europe. And that's what launched the modern political Zionist movement. If there's no future for Jews in Europe, we need to get them somewhere else. And that's what Zionism was all about. I think many Jews had Herzl moments roughly October 8th, 2023, looking at the way so many campuses and so many cities responded to the terrorist atrocity, which was the October 7th massacre. They responded not with horror and condemnation, but with celebration and endorsement and calls for more. And that woke up a lot of Jews, I believe. They hadn't realized how the world, our world, the Western world, America, had been turning against the Jews for quite some number of years. My own Herzl moment was 11 years ago now. Just to summarize it very briefly, a Facebook post I had written defending Israel during the course of the 2014 war with Hamas, which seems so long ago and so quaint in comparison to what we've endured over the last 2.5 years now. Um, this Facebook post got twisted out of context and was represented, rather than as me defending Israel from genocidal attacks of this terrorist group Hamas, it got represented as me being a racist against Palestinians, which was an utter not just a misreading, but a willful, distorted representation of what this post was. And it led to really a massive cancellation campaign. There were international death threats. There were petitions going around the world calling for me to be fired, etc. And that was the moment that I just understood, saw, and realized in a phrase that I'll qualify later, that anti-Zionism, this hostility to Israel on so many campuses, just is anti-Semitism. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So this was in 2015. And once we began to recover from the fear of the death threats and all that sort of stuff, I really turned my scholarship over this past decade to focusing on anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, with a special focus on the campus scene. I spent most of the past 10 years as the campus bureau editor for the Allgemeiner, which is a wonderful news source that focuses on Jews in Israel. Everybody should subscribe to the free daily newsletter. The step one of doing anything is being informed, and the Allgemeiner is a wonderful resource for staying informed. So I was the campus bureau editor. So in that capacity for 10 years, I have just followed the campus scene so unbelievably closely. Probably not good for my mental health, but someone has to do it. So I took the hit for all of you. The Allgemeiner would report on these stories. I would share each day my list of possible stories. The Allgemeiner could only cover a small percentage of the incidents that were happening. And indeed, I do now publish online on my Twitter account and elsewhere daily lists of relevant incidents. So if you want to enjoy my mental health situation, please follow me for those lists. Over the past 11 years, I've watched the trajectory very, very carefully and closely, and I have seen this hostility to Israel, which was already bad in 2014, 2015. It's what produced this cancellation campaign against me and others at the time. I've watched this trajectory grow in both quantity and quality, the frequency of incidents on campus and the hostility and intensity of them on campuses. I've watched the anti-Israel movement go from advocating for a two-state solution, i.e., the Palestinians should have a state, to just openly advocating for the destruction of the Jewish state. They don't even pretend that it's two states anymore. It's been a few years since that happened. And so for me, when October 7th, October 8th happened, none of it was surprising. It was the next logical step in this trajectory that campuses would erupt in celebration of October 7th. It was still shocking and horrifying to see it actually happening, but for someone like me who's been watching this trajectory for 11 years, it was obvious that this was going to happen, that this was the next obvious step. I've spent a lot of those years also writing about these issues. I wrote stories about individual incidents, but because I'm a philosophy professor and I'm interested in theory and ideology, I've also spent a lot of time studying the ideology which produces this hostility to Israel and therefore to Jews. And indeed, a few months ago, I published. No, you're not seeing double. This is a 2-volume work. Israel Breathes, World Condemns. The one on the left is volume 1, The Trajectory. The one on the right is volume 2, The Aftermath. I've collected my writings of the last 11 years into these 2 volumes, and it was interesting exercise to do this because this is when I saw that without even trying to, simply because I was watching so closely, I really was charting, documenting, and analyzing this trajectory up to October 7th. And then I have continued to document and analyze and try to understand what campuses have become since October 7th. That's volume 2. So these books are available in very inexpensive editions. They're coming out in much more expensive academic editions in a couple of months. So get them now. You can get them through my website if you are interested. I've also spent this past 10 years shifting my teaching. I see it as sort of my obligation to bring dissident ideas, since many campuses are almost a totalitarian, uniform view of these issues. I'm the guy who's trying to just bring the dissident voice, the Zionist voice. I'm the only open Zionist on my campus. I am actually abused pretty badly on my campus. This is why my user handle for my Substack is pariah, but the truth you know ain't a democracy. I may be a pariah. I may be the only one who has the views that I have on my campus, but I might be right, right? Truth doesn't go by majority vote, and especially in this particular issue. And so, what I've seen, and I've given other webinars on this, and could elaborate in the question section if you're interested. But this perfect storm that really produced October 7th, we've had critical race theory plus post-colonialism, if those phrases mean anything to you, which created the DEI industry. The DEI industry, for whatever good it has done, is systemically and institutionally ill-disposed towards Israel and the Jews, to put it lightly. This created a kind of anti-West coalition, which is this dominant ideology on so many campuses, and then throw in COVID and George Floyd, which I think produced a kind of collective mania. When October 7th happened, the campuses were just primed to explode in this frenzied madhouse of violent hostility. Like I said, it wasn't a surprise to me, however shocking it was to see it. I also, just for example, last spring semester, developed a new course called Big Ideas of the 20th Century because I wanted to understand how the 20th century went from Zionism being a very big and fairly popular idea in certain circles at the beginning of the 20th century. By the time we get to the end of the 20th century, the turn has seriously begun. Anti-Zionism has become the big idea. So we got to go through the critical race theory and the post-colonialism and to see exactly how that created this turn against Israel and the Jews. So that's what I've been doing on campuses. So let me just talk briefly about the current situation at universities as of February of 2026. I am dealing with on the great scale of things, fairly moderately unpleasant situation on my own campus. We have had, shortly after October 7th, a few anti-Zionist professors launched what they called an educational series on Israel-Palestine, as if to understand what had happened in the conflict. And what it turned out to be was a series consisting entirely of anti-Israel lectures that essentially were teaching the message Israel deserved it and worse, right? They launched this just a few weeks after October 7th. They kept this series up that whole year, 23-24. They then continued the series 24-25. They continued it in last fall semester. Is that the fall of 2025? They've had to date 15 lectures, right? So because 14, 12, 13 were not enough, 15 lectures, all anti-Israel, all essentially justifying the October 7th massacre, as if they're trying to get the students stirred up, and indeed they are succeeding. As I mentioned, am abused pretty regularly by students. In particular, there's an anonymous like side chat thing which I have students send me screenshots of because yeah, I feel like I need to know what they're saying, and they're regularly, let's say, abusing me, is I think put it mildly. So that's not very pleasant, but screw them. I'm going to forge ahead anyway. Um, I think that just after October 7th, many campuses, and of course it's not all, but it's the major ones, the Ivy Leagues and the big Midwestern public universities, and of course the West Coast, etc. It's the universities where there are the most Jews traditionally. Jews are now shifting in their demographics a little bit to as a response to this. So, of the thousands of campuses, the majority were actually pretty quiet, but those were schools where Jews typically don't attend. But the big ones, the prestigious ones, etc., that's where the problem has been. I think many of them got to the point where they literally could not get any worse without becoming indistinguishable from 1930s Nazi Germany. That's how bad I think the situation was. What should one do about it? We can maybe get into this in the question answer period. People are, on all sides of, for example, what the Trump administration is doing in response to campuses. So let me just say one mildly controversial thing. I understand a lot of different points of view with respect to what at least the federal government is doing. Um, but I think the following is the case, that the ideology that has produced this atmosphere, this anti-Jewish atmosphere, is simply too entrenched, and there's now too many faculty members who have tenure and aren't going anywhere, who are too entrenched, and the institutions that dominate, such as the DEI industry, are institutionally inhospitable to the Jews in Israel. So there are literally no mechanisms within the university itself to fix the problem. I really believe that. So if they are going to be fixed, outside forces will be necessary, such as government forces. That doesn't mean I can say what are the exact methods the federal government should use, et cetera, but that the federal government is getting involved seems to me necessary at this particular stage, not just to protect or defend the Jews, but actually to rescue the academy from an ideology which isn't merely hostile to the Jews, but is really inconsistent with the norms of the academy. Again, that doesn't mean I'm in favor of the specific things the Trump administration is doing in different places, but that they're intervening at all seems to be absolutely necessary. And happy to discuss that further in the question answer section. But equally importantly, maybe more importantly for us, the Jewish community, the Zionist friendly community that includes many allies, including many Christians, etc. We need a new strategy on our end. I think it's pretty clear, especially in the academic community. And some of you, if you're active on social media, you've been hearing quite a bit of chatter about these issues in recent weeks. There's a new organization rose, I think early last summer, called the Movement Against Anti-Zionism. I strongly recommend that you follow them. I had already been working sort of in a similar vein for a while, but they motivated me to pick up my work in this particular area. And it starts from the recognition that the claim that anti-Zionism just is anti-Semitism, and you remember I said that right at the beginning, my Herzl moment. Once anti-Zionism, you see there anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Well, that's the way the community has been framing things for really at least 20 years now. That's been the strategy we've taken, and I think we have to just admit empirically that strategy has failed. I know, we all know that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but we have simply failed to convince anybody else. That's simply what's happened. They're refusing to be convinced. That includes the many, many haters. It includes the administrators. Unfortunately, what has won that debate is that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, however clearly we understand that it is. So the strategy has failed, and it certainly has failed to stem the growing tide of Jew hatred that we're seeing on campuses. Because that tide, as I mentioned, I've watched this trajectory get worse and worse, both quantitatively and qualitatively over the last 11 years. In fact, I would suggest that every strategy we have tried over the last 10 to 20 years has failed. Well, we know it's failed because look at October 8th on campuses and the subsequent 2 years going on to this very day. In fact, we're about to hit Israeli Apartheid Week on a number of campuses when they just bring in these big panels, and for some reason they're permitted to stick them in the middle of the campus and spread all these lies about Israel, right? So whatever we've done, we know has failed. But what have we done? We've done a number of things. The IRA definition of anti-Semitism, some will be familiar with that. And we've pushed that really hard and got a number of schools to adopt it. But it failed. They adopt it and then they don't use it. It does absolutely nothing. We focused on the positive aspects of Zionism in Israel, like made the deserts bloom, curing cancer, cherry tomatoes, the iPhone, like all these wonderful achievements has failed. In retrospect, it's obvious why it failed. The other side has painted a picture where Israel and the Jews who support Israel are genocidal, ethnic cleansing baby killers. So who cares if they invent a cherry tomato? Hitler made the trains run on time, but he was a genocidal monster. It's not going to redeem him, right? So Israel makes all these wonderful contributions to humanity, science, technology, medicine, philanthropy. It doesn't matter because they are winning this war of the narratives. Jewish studies programs are now almost entirely infiltrated by anti-Zionists. They spend their day producing scholarship on how evil Israel is. Even some of the Israel studies programs that have been established, partly because Middle East studies programs all turned uniformly anti-Zionist and indeed typically won't discuss Israel except to bash Israel. So in response, we were able to form a number of Israel studies centers, and even those have now started to become infiltrated by anti-Zionists. And just, I think, is it next week at Brown University, there's a conference sponsored by the Jewish Studies Department that's exploring the question whether it's time for Israel studies to become Israel and Palestine studies, which is offensive on so many levels I can't even begin to enumerate them. There's already a Middle East Studies department at Brown that is viciously, viciously anti-Zionist, and it churns out endless anti-Israel scholarship. So now Israel studies, which is meant to be a safe space or at least a different space, right? That has to now be infiltrated by Palestine studies as well. So Jewish studies failed, Israel studies failed. Holocaust studies, as important and necessary as that is, it has also failed, indeed, as was it Sarah Hurwitz, the Obama speechwriter? She caused a little controversy a couple months ago when she basically said people are taking the wrong lessons from the Holocaust. Where the Holocaust study has become very universalized. We're not allowed to portray the Holocaust as a genocidal attack on the Jews as the primary victims, or at least front and center victims, or something like that. The lessons we're supposed to learn is that all hate is bad and all killing is bad, which of course they are. But that means even Holocaust studies is no longer something about the Jews. It's a general lesson. And because the other side controls the narrative, we're all against genocide. They study the Holocaust to learn we're against genocide. And that's what's the next thing they say? Gaza. So we've learned we need to fight back against Israel. So Holocaust studies, however valuable and important and necessary it is, it's all failed. And indeed, when you look at most of the lawsuits that popped up after October 7th, of these campus lawsuits, they're largely failing as well. A couple just in the past couple of days, this one's not a campus one, but in the United Kingdom, a group called Palestine Action, which in my view ought to be classified as a domestic terrorist group because they go to businesses and they break in and they destroy them. Any businesses that are related to Israel or connected to arms that might support Israel in any way. They literally trespass, break in, burgle, destroy property, etc. And in this past year, in one of these episodes, not only did they destroy a whole bunch of property, but they also smashed a policewoman and smashed her spine in the back. They were just put on trial and they were acquitted, and it wasn't in contest that they did these things, that they broke in, they vandalized, they injured this person. But basically the reasoning is if it's for Palestine, if it's anti-Zionism, then it's a form of political expression. Don't even get me started on how ridiculous that is. There's a big difference between speech and behavior, and breaking in, destroying property, and hurting people is not speech. But nevertheless, because anti-Zionism, in the minds of too many people, has been separated from anti-Semitism, if it's anti-Zionism, it's basically political expression. So it's a get out of jail free card. Unless you think that's just in England, Stanford University, there were a number of students who were charged with felonies for a protest, I think in 2024, where they again broke into a building, caused, I think, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage. The prosecutor went for certain felony charges there. It just came back a couple of days ago. It was a locked jury and it's a mistrial. And basically, again, well, it's anti-Zionism. It's not anti-Semitism. And so it's basically, again, as long as you do it for Palestine, you can do almost anything. Indeed, think about how campuses responded to the October 7th massacre. Sure, they massacred 1,200 people, most of whom were civilians, and a whole bunch of whom were, children and elderly and pregnant women, etc. But free Palestine, right? That wasn't anti-Semitism, that's just anti-Zionism, and it's therefore okay. So we've lost this debate, even though we all know anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. We've lost it. And now anti-Zionism is a get out of jail free card. And I could go into more detail on like the MIT and the Harvard cases and also one at Ohio State, where again, anti-Zionism is getting these people and institutions off scot-free. So we need to do something else, right? Trying to argue that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism has simply failed. So what we need to do, and this is the insight of the movement against anti-Zionism and my new initiative as well, the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism, we need to focus on anti-Zionism in its own right, apart from whatever relationship it might have to anti-Semitism. The distinction is very subtle. You can still believe, as I do, that anti-Zionism is a form of Jewish hate, but the idea is to grant at least the important surface differences between traditional anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. In other words, anti-Semitism is one form of Jewish hate, anti-Zionism is a different form of Jewish hate. And so on the surface, we're granting anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism in the same way that pancreatic cancer is not lung cancer. They're different diseases. They share something, right? They're both forms of cancer, but you can't treat pancreatic cancer the way you would treat lung cancer. It's a different form of cancer. So too, you can't treat anti-Zionism the same way you treat anti-Semitism. It's a different form of Jew hate. And we know, again, we've lost the debate, so we now have to grant that they are different forms. And so keeping an eye on the time, there's really, just to get a little bit into the theory here, there's really a three-way distinction that we should make, and it's a very fuzzy distinction. These things can overlap. The same person can perpetrate one or two or all three of them even at the same time, but just conceptually we'll distinguish first anti-Judaism from anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism is the traditional form of Jew hate that goes back at the very least to the beginning of Christianity, also in Islam, another thing we should talk about at some point, right? And this is religious hatred of Jews. It is antagonism primarily to the Jewish religion, as opposed to classic anti-Semitism, which really only arises in the late 18th, early 19th century in Europe. There's some differences there. So anti-Judaism is attacking the religion. Anti-Semitism, as this is typically used, is the ethnic or race-based 19th century hostility to the Jews. These have different histories, right? Christianity versus post-Enlightenment. They have different motives. One has religious motives, the other has secular and nationalist motives. They use different language and indeed invoke different libels, these lies that are cast about the Jews. So anti-Judaism, or Jew hatred talked about Jews being Christ killers or ritual child murderers or poisoners of the well or the synagogue of Satan, etc. Whereas 19th century European anti-Semites talked about Jews being race polluters and parasites and having dual loyalty and being bankers or communists, depending, or both in certain cases, the conspiracy theory versions of anti-Semitism. So the language is very, very different. They're both forms of hating Jews, but they're different forms of hating Jews with different manifestations, different histories, and often different proponents. The typical Christian anti-Semite is going to be a different kind of person than the typical racial anti-Semite of the 19th century. And of course, the epitome of the racial anti-Semitism is the Nazi Holocaust. So once we're comfortable distinguishing anti-Judaism from anti-Semitism, again, deep down, they're both forms of Jew hate, but they're different forms with different histories, different libels, different proponents by and large. And yes, one person can be both. That happens plenty enough. We're going to do the same thing now with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. We say, anti-Semitism targets Jews as Jews, whatever that means, but anti-Zionism only targets Israel. So on the surface, there's a difference. And indeed, when you study these a little bit, you'll see they actually have different basic histories, different major proponents. They use different language and libels, and they use different symbols. So just to summarize a bit of this here, I'm keeping an eye on the time. Here's some memes that some of these are produced by the Movement Against Anti-Zionism, which does a lot of good memes. But if you just look on the left, they're contrasting, let's say, anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Anti-Semitism is characterized by swastikas and skinheads. Anti-Zionism is keffiyehs and red triangles of Hamas. Anti-Semitism's main thing is that Jews were not white, whereas, of course, anti-Zionism's main thing is that Jews are too white. They are white and they don't belong in the Middle East. Anti-Semitism was big on Holocaust denial. It never happened, right? Anti-Zionism is very big on Holocaust inversion. Yes, it happened. Anti-Zionists, by the way, hate anti-Semitism, so they say, but they accuse the Jews of being the new Nazis. That's Holocaust inversion, right? So that's their primary motif. Anti-Semitism emerged 19th century Europe, hit this peak in Nazi Germany. Anti-Zionism, when you study the history, really emerged, this left-wing anti-Zionism emerged from the Soviet Union in the really the 1940s and especially in the 1950s and 60s. And again, different characters, right? The skinheads versus the campus activists, etc. So there's a lot of differences. Again, a different history, different major proponents. The one on the left is right wing. The one on the right is left wing, right? Different and different libels, which we can see as we move to the middle meme here. The libels of classical anti-Semitism, which typically trace back to this book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Remember that webinar next Sunday by Professor Richard Landis is going to talk about how anti-Zionism ultimately traces back to the protocols. But that's filled with the Jews are the bankers and also the communists, right? The Bolshevism there. Jews are not loyal citizens of their country. They're loyal to other Jews. Those are the classic libels. But anti-Zionism, of course, accuses the Jews collectively. The big three are colonization, apartheid, and genocide. So they focus on different libels. Right? And you see this nicely summarized in the one on the right. I'll read the anti-Semites first. Anti-Semites said, go, leave Europe, go back to Palestine, right? That's what they said, go back to Israel. Anti-Zionists say, leave Israel, go back to Poland. They literally say that. Anti-Semites say you can't live here as a minority, right? They wanted to get the Jews out as a minority. Anti-Zionists say the Jews can't live as a majority in their own country. Anti-Semitism saw the Jews as non-white polluters of the white race. Anti-Zionists see them as hyper-white colonizers. So you get the basic picture here, right? They are really different in their grammar, in their structure, in their focus, in their political orientation. They are both forms of Jew hate, but they are different forms of Jew hate. And so the difference in forms has allowed the other side to win this debate. Anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. That allows them to suggest it's merely a political expression, it's a political point of view, it's political criticism or something like that. And this explains their victories on campus and their victories in the course. And I also want to share with these as well, because I think these really nail it from our point of view, right? So the one on the left, there's three main ways to hate Jews. Anti-Judaism, and then here are the libels that traditional religious anti-Jewishness took. Anti-Semitism is the second one, and those are those libels. Anti-Zionism is the third one, so we were just looking at those on the previous slide. And you can then see all the ways they link together. I won't focus on that, but then look at the one on the right, this just came out today, actually, and I think this just nails it, right? Anti-Judaism attacks Torah Yisrael, the Torah of Israel, Israel, the people, right? The collectivity, which is the Jews. Anti-Semitism attacks Am Yisrael, the people themselves. So anti-Judaism attacks the Torah, the religion. Anti-Semitism attacks the people. Anti-Zionism attacks Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the homeland of these people, etc., right? So they're all ways of attacking Jews, but they're different ways of attacking Jews, or they're attacking different aspects of Jews, the Torah, the people, their homeland, right? So what we need to do is recognize this. We've lost the battle just empirically. And the reason we've lost it is we've been so busy trying to push anti-Zionism into the anti-Semitism box where it doesn't naturally fit because there's so many differences between them. We have to acknowledge those differences and go deeper now and see how they, as the one on the right says, they're all different ways of attacking Jews. So I've launched, again, I mentioned Movement Against Anti-Zionism. Definitely find them and follow them. I've launched the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism. Here's basic contact information. There's the website on the left. And underneath it, it has its own dedicated Substack. So please feel free, if you want to find out more about it, write that down, subscribe to the Substack. It's free. The idea is to focus scholarly attention. And here's something else we haven't done. We've spent the last 20 years playing defense. They've been on the offense for at least 20 years, probably more. And we know they're endlessly slinging libels against Israel and the Jews. The big three are the colonizers, racism slash apartheid, and genocide in particular, right? And we're endlessly saying, no, we're refuting that all the time. No, we're not racist, and we're not settler colonialists, and we're not committing genocide. And I actually wrote a whole long monograph refuting all of those lies because it's important to refute them. But what that's done is it's put us in the dock or the docket, right? We're on trial. We've been on trial. This is an old pattern, right? Going back to at least medieval Christianity, putting the Jews on trial. We've been on trial on campuses, and let's face it, the more you're frequently you're saying, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, the people around you start thinking, yeah, he probably did it because he's constantly, the lady doth protest too much. They're constantly having to deny it because of this strategy of just endlessly accusing us, and all we do is endlessly defend ourselves from these accusations, we've actually lost the emotional battle on campuses as well. Everyone just sort of thinks we're probably guilty. And most of the students who go through a campus, most of them don't really care about this issue. They're college students. They want hookups and parties, and maybe some want to study or whatever. And what do they care about a conflict half a world away? But what happens is they go to college for 4 years and it's just drenched in these libels against Israel, and Israelis and Jews constantly denying it. They walk away thinking, well, they're probably guilty, right? They're probably guilty, right? Here's what we've never done. We've never put them on trial. We haven't gone after them. We haven't attacked them. We haven't even critiqued them. Individual bits of scholarship here and there, but collectively, the Jewish community hasn't done that, and the Jewish scholarly community. And there's a number of reasons for it, including that we're very nice people and we don't like to go on the attack, I would like to say collectively. We've also are living in this ideological environment where um, it's not cool to attack those who are seen as marginalized or discriminated against, like people of color. To critique people of color is to exert your power over them. And on campus, at least, the Palestinians and Muslims in general are classified as marginalized people of color. So it's just not cool to criticize them. You're going to be labeled a racist immediately. And indeed, they've created this terminology where any critique of their attacks on us, you're a racist for critiquing them, right? So this is the political environment this has been happening in. And so we're both nice and don't want to do it. And if we've wanted to do it, we're hampered from doing it because you're immediately labeled a racist, and the DEI people will come after you for criticizing the anti-Israel crowd, right? So we've had our hands behind our back, but time for that is over, right? We're in an emergency, I believe. So things are changing now. So the goal of this institute is to produce and promote and disseminate critical scholarship on the history, evolution, and contemporary manifestations of anti-Zionism as an ideology, as a worldview, and as a movement, and to expose, and this is a whole other webinar, so please come see my webinars that I mentioned earlier, to expose that today's anti-Zionism grows out of the same root as anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. It's a form of hatred and hostility towards Jews. A different form from traditional anti-Semitism, but a form of that nevertheless, right? And indeed, when you study, for example, the webinar, we'll start with the protocols, as Professor Landis, but we're going to have a webinar on the Nazis, on the Soviets, and on the Islamists. And we're going to see that this attack on the collective enterprise of the Jewish people, Israel, Zionism, etc., comes out of literally eliminationist Jew hatred in the Nazis, in the Soviets, and the Islamists. Today's campus activists have no idea the slogans that they're chanting are literally Nazi slogans. In theory, they would be horrified to learn that because they say they hate the Nazis, right? The Nazis are the paradigm of evil. They don't realize they are literally just repeating the playbook of the Nazis. And so it is the job of this institute to get that message out. And the idea that, this conspiracy theory anti-Semitism from the protocols is alive and well, but now simply applied to Israel, anti-Zionism, it's all over the place. This was literally just last week in the Free Press. There was in the Thank God It's Friday edition of the Free Press. I think it might have been 2 Fridays ago, right? They just summarized the news of the previous week or so. Israel does it all. What can't Jews and Israelis do this day? A prominent American leftist says Israel makes the ICE software and calls the United States of ICE real. Meanwhile, online right-wingers say Jews are behind mass migration, and one influential internet Nazi even says Jews made Alex Preddy's gun misfire. He was the person that ICE killed, the nurse. The gun was Jewish, basically, right? I'll be wrapping up momentarily. In South America, a series of devastating summer wildfires were being blamed on Israelis. In Spain, a bunch of trains derailed on the nation's overtaxed infrastructure, and who was blamed? Israelis. Did you know that the bullets found in Iranian children during the recent protests were, according to the Iranian government, Israeli bullets, right? This is literally the conspiracy theory anti-Semitism of the protocols of the elders of Nazi, not protocols of the elders of Zion, upgraded, updated to be 21st century conspiracies about Israel. Anti-Zionism is just repeating the same tropes and the same strategy and playbook as the earlier forms of anti-Semitism. So we need to expose that. We need teams of scholars producing reams of scholarship exposing anti-Zionism for what it is. So that's what ICSA is trying to do. So I hope that you will follow us, support us. You can start by following me here. You can come to this webinar. If you register for it, but can't make it live, you will get a recording afterwards. So please go ahead and at least register for this webinar. When you go to the link, you'll see actually the list of all 6 webinars. You could pre-register for all of them if you like, but at the very least, start with this one next Sunday and join in because, again, it's an existential moment. We need all hands on deck. Everybody needs to do whatever it is they're capable of doing. And I guess it begins by your coming to this webinar tonight. So thank you. And let's definitely turn to some questions or objections. And the good thing about a webinar is you can't throw tomatoes at me. So you can throw it at your own screen, but I'm safe. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Pessin. That was great. I know we just got a taste of some of the research and knowledge that you share, but we got some great questions. So one of them was, can you expand on the inclusion of DEI in the academic incitement of Jew hate or anti-Zionism? I know of DEI being demonized by right-wing politics, but I'm unfamiliar with it being anti-Jew.
Thank you for that question, and it's a very important question. And I'll give the short version of the answer, and if there's time, I can give a much longer version of this answer. So DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion is sort of the typical name for these ideas that came out of critical race theory that originally had a lot of value. This is what I learned in producing that course, Big Ideas of the 20th Century. I wanted to read some of the original primary texts of critical race theory. It's a recognition that there is sort of built-in racism that needs correcting, and all that's right and good, in my opinion, right? And I have no doubt perhaps the DEI offices, every single major campus, in fact, big campuses, I can't remember the numbers, but like University of Michigan had something like, I don't know, like 97 different DEI administrators, because you need one for every division of the universities, the arts, the sciences, and then like even, the humanities alone, they had their own, and the medical school has its own. So like it's a whole industry, right? And I'm willing to grant good things came of it. So I'm not one of the sort of fanatic right-wing critics who don't like the whole idea of it. The whole idea they don't like is that it is a form of reverse racism, right? It's a form of saying we need to correct for systemic racism by anti-racism in the opposite direction, which basically means like people of color and other marginalized groups, whether it's gays or trans people and or women for a while, but they're sort of getting left out now. Um, we need to over we need to support their representation, right? So it basically means don't hire white people, hire black people. That's very crude. That's a right-wing person speaking. So I'm not that. I think there's some value to it. However, critical race theory from which DEI grows, I said I was going to give the short answer, maybe lie, um, uh, has a very simple binary. There's oppressor and oppressed, and what they care, this comes out of Marxism, but instead of economic class being the basis for oppressor and oppressed, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, they focus on race, basically whites oppressing people of color, and they see these as group identities. So roughly speaking, all whites oppress all people of color. Even poor whites are oppressing rich people of color on this ideology, but that's basically how they think. And so, in their mind, to become successful is essentially to be part of a white supremacy structure and therefore to be an oppressor. And because Jews on average became successful in America, right? Starting in the 1950s or so, after the war and after the Holocaust, things opened up. People call this the golden age of Jews in America. Lasted from the 50s into, I would say, the early 2000s, and now it's really just about over, in my view, right? But the idea is Jews who were discriminated against started overcoming that and becoming successful. When I went to college, I recently actually checked my class. I graduated the year of 1984. Clearly at least 20% of the names in my graduating class were Jewish names. Today, the statistics there, it's like 6 or 7%, right? So Jews became successful, but on this DEI critical race theory ideology, to become successful is to become part of the oppressor class, and therefore it's bad. And Jews, because they're more successful than other white people on average, are seen as hyper white or uber white. That's where that language came from. So in other words, Jews are the top of the heap of the oppressors. They are the master oppressors. This is the ideology that DEI essentially operates under, which means Jews can never be victims. It doesn't make sense to think of a Jew as a victim because a Jew is an oppressor. Which is why when Jewish students came to DEI people in the aftermath of October 7th and said, we're being harassed, we're being ostracized, we're being spat on, and things like that, literally almost no action was taken anywhere. They were told, all right, well, we can hook you up with a mental health person, right, to give you some support. But the idea that Jews could be victims just doesn't fit into that philosophy. Not on our campuses domestically, but also then they project that onto the Middle East. So Israelis are just white supremacist oppressors of Palestinians who are marginalized, oppressed people of color. So of course you side with the marginalized people of color. DEI offices, and there were some studies done, DEI offices overwhelmingly supported Hamas's attacks and some more supported the anti-Israel protesters on campus because of this ideology. So, whatever merit or value it has for correcting racism problems in the United States, when it's applied to the Jews, it basically is a contemporary version of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Jews are on the top of the heap, controlling everything and oppressing everybody else. And they're really no different from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is the shocking thing. So, that was a medium length answer to that excellent question. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent. And then you got several questions about Qatari influence. How
Uh-huh.
much of this increase in hate do you think is related to increased Qatari influence? Money in the West. Somebody else said, can you please talk about the money?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's been much in the news for people who are interested in this issue, namely the foreign money, specifically Arab money, but specifically the money from Qatar. I recommend following ISGAP. That's the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP. They're the ones that have been doing the groundbreaking work, exposing how many millions of dollars many major universities accepted and didn't disclose over the last 10 or 15 years. So, Qatar, I think, is number one on the list by a large margin. And you can trace, and this is what ISGAP is doing, you can trace that, there's a couple of main manifestations of this. So, first of all, a number of universities have opened satellite campuses in Qatar. So a chunk of the money goes to establishing those campuses there. Like NYU has a campus in Qatar. And it turns out in Qatar, they have to follow Qatari law. Well, that makes sense. But Qatari law says you're not allowed to criticize Qatar, basically, right? Or criticize Islam. And so you end up having these campuses taking this money and developing a very cozy relationship, let's say, with the Qatar government. And then Qatar will also give money to the home campus, which will fund chairs in Middle East studies or entire Middle East studies departments, where they get to choose or have heavy influence in the professors. And so, with this money, universities are beholden to Qatar, also Saudi Arabia, and a number of other, Arab and Muslim countries who are no friends, I would argue, of the United States, certainly no friends of Jews in Israel. And so, this and indeed, the most recent report suggested was this I think Northwestern also has a campus there. I think Qatar was able to choose who was the head DEI administrator at Northwestern, right? So they are ensuring that the DEI person is anti-Israel, which helps, of course, advance the anti-Israel agenda. And so this money is giving institutional influence to allow these universities to continue on their anti-Israel path. So it's clearly important. It's not the only factor, and this turn occurred even before this money started coming in large, billions of dollars, etc. In Western campuses, at least the early 2000s, this campaign was underway even before that money started coming in. Columbia is also another place, right? They're Middle East studies, and they have a Center for Palestine Studies, which I'm fairly sure is funded largely externally, right? But the problems began before the money, but the money then just amplifies it enormously. So it's a serious issue, and there's now efforts to get some legislation in place, which at the very least requires disclosure, right? Because a lot of this money was coming in and nobody knew. At the very least, you need to make it public information that Qatar has just given you $1 billion or something like that, or hundreds of millions of dollars, so people can, know what they're dealing with. So I believe legislation is in process to begin at least requiring transparency. But in fact, I think someone has even proposed in Congress a bill which would restrict foreign donations to these universities, which is complicated because we do believe in free speech and we believe almost anybody should be able to, contribute money to a university. But clearly there's a problem when a hostile foreign government is taking over a university by its donations. So I hope that Congress will sort that out.
Right. Wow. Great answer. You also got several questions about addressing anti-Zionism coming from people who call themselves Jews. How do we address this? How do we deal with this?
Oh, these questions are so good and so hard, and this is one, it's so heartbreaking. Uh, it- uh, w- I want ICSA. I have this incredibly long list of projects that ICSA, my institute, needs to produce, and there will be a whole section devoted to the question and issue of Jewish anti-Zionism. And I probably should put together a whole webinar on that. I'm thinking about it because there's a lot of angles. Jewish anti-Zionism, of course, begins with modern political Zionism. From the beginning, Herzl, a lot of people were opposed to Zionism. A lot of Jews were opposed to Zionism. But I just want to stress that Jewish anti-Zionism before 1948, like, almost cannot be compared to post 1948 Jewish anti-Zionism. Before 1948, in my view, there were really reasonable questions and doubts about whether Zionism was a good idea for the Jewish community, right? Some people thought it was just unfeasible. Others really thought that Jews could make it in Europe and especially in America. America was the golden land, right? About to enter its golden age for the Jews. Others were, of course, Bolsheviks or communists or socialists, and they were not that interested in. They certainly wanted to get rid of their Jewish religious identity, and they wanted to modernize. And they thought once everybody's socialist, then we'll have a kind of egalitarianism, and racial prejudice would go away. All those were reasonable things to debate in the first decades of the 20th century. No one could know the future, but at least in my own view, the Holocaust made it clear that Zionism was right, and anti-Zionism was wrong. Zionism is what saved the lives of a lot of Jews, and all these other forms of Jewish anti-Zionism just failed. And in fact, most of the people who were Jewish anti-Zionists ended up in the gas chambers, right? So to me, the argument was decided by the Holocaust. And maybe the best way to make that point is prior to the state of Israel, at least most of the Jewish anti-Zionists didn't hate the Jews. They wanted what was best for the Jews. They just thought Zionism wasn't it, right? They thought staying in Europe was it, assimilating was it, becoming a socialist was it. They didn't hate the Jews. That's, they had antagonism towards the religious, but they didn't hate the Jewish people. They wanted what was best for the Jewish people. Post 1948, once the state of Israel is established, then everything's different because now anti-Zionism doesn't mean, oh, I don't think this is the best idea for us, moving forward. I think we should do something else. It now means undoing an existing state, right? It's like the difference between, there's the joke, my wife and I have decided we don't want children. We're going to tell them tonight, right? If you get that joke, right? There's a big difference between deciding not to have children in advance and then having the children and deciding afterwards to get rid of them, right? The first is a decision not to have children. The second is murder. And roughly speaking, once the state of Israel is established, whether you like it or not, whether you like its policies or not, um, anti-Zionism is automatically something that is immensely hostile to tremendous numbers of Jews. And that's only grown since 1948. And when the state of Israel was established, I'm never good with exact numbers, but like 10% of the world's Jews live there, very small percentage. But today, 50% of the world's Jews live there. So to dismantle Israel today in this environment where it's literally surrounded by neighbors who want to commit genocide and ethnic cleansing means you are looking at 7 million Jews being ethnically cleansed at best and probably murdered at worst, right? So anti-Zionism today, in my view, cannot be maintained apart from tremendous hostility towards half the world's Jews. And of course, it's more than half the world's Jews because we know that it's not only the 7 million Jews who live in Israel, but the significant majority of Jews who live outside of Israel are supportive of Israel, have family in Israel, spend time in Israel, right? So anti-Zionism today can only be understood as hostility to Jews, which was not true before 1948. And so therefore, if you have a Jewish anti-Zionist, most of them will say it's not hostility towards Jews. They think it's about Palestinian rights, but it actually almost never is. I'd have to elaborate on that. It really is about removing rights from Jews. So I can only, in the end, see it as a form of self-hatred, something like that, right? And that's a complicated notion. They will not accept that. They will say, no, I do it because I love the Jews and I think it would be best for the Jews to dismantle their oppressive state and live in democratic harmony with these people who want to annihilate them, right? It's foolishness at best. So I haven't quite answered the question, but every Jewish anti-Zionist has their own sort of journey or path, how they became there. It's a little hard to generalize. Some do come out of ignorance. Some come out of naivety. Some come out of, especially on the college scene, there is tremendous social pressure to be an anti-Zionist. So, and if you're a Jewish anti-Zionist, if you're a Jewish Zionist on campus, like me, you're a pariah. You're ostracized. You're hated. You're excluded from clubs. Not that many people will want to date you. Things like that, things that matter, right? But if you're an anti-Zionist, not only do you get to join the cool club and you get to like go to the encampments, which were also like a big party, like for young people, even if you're not that political, like how rebellious and exciting. So if you become an anti-Zionist, it's like your social horizons open up dramatically. And if you're a Jewish anti-Zionist, suddenly you're like a superhero. They love you because that's what protects them from being called anti-Semites, from being called Jew haters. If we have Jews amongst us. So think about the choice so many college students have to make. Jewish students. If I'm a Zionist, I'm hated, I'm ostracized, I'm excluded from things. No one will date me. If I become an anti-Zionist, not only am I part of the cool club, but they're gonna elevate me and they're gonna center me, right? I'm gonna be at the front of every one of these rallies and they're gonna love me. So some of them go that route. It's just like the social pressure, right? So it's a complicated phenomenon. It needs a lot of scholarly attention. So there will be a whole segment of my institute devoted to understanding the many different journeys that Jewish students in particular take towards their anti-Zionism.
Wow. Yeah, that's really important to highlight those experiences. You also got quite a few questions about professors on campuses. So many of the most flamingly anti-Zionist, Jew-hating, or anti-white professors on our local Duke and UNC campuses are tenured, so project an attitude of invincibility. How would you suggest addressing this larger issue, which includes hatred of white Christians too?
Wow. So again, fantastic question. A study just came out from Amcha Initiative, which is a wonderful organization. They've been documenting the campus scene. In fact, I share my listings with them for quite a long time, and they've been doing all sorts of sort of social science research with their database of these incidents. And what they have been demonstrating through a number of studies over the last few years, but an absolutely major one, I haven't read the whole thing yet, it's 150 pages, just came out a few days ago. Basically the faculty are the problem. They are the key part of the problem. And not students come and go. They come to college, they're there for a few years, they leave. Faculty are basically forever, right? So without question, if you want to fix this problem, you have to address the faculty situation. Tenure, I do believe in the long run, tenure is on the way out, and that's probably a good thing. There were many good reasons to have the tenure system. I'm grateful to tenure because as the pariah, tenure has protected me on my campus from being the lone Zionist voice. It really hard. In fact, just this past week on Yik Yak, students are calling for another campaign to fire Pessin because I'm a racist because I support Israel, right? So thank goodness for tenure. It protects me. Unfortunately, it also protects them, right? And so, at least for the long game, and this will not be fixed overnight, right? The other side really started, it was explicit, a campaign 20 years ago to take over universities, and we were just sort of, twiddling our thumbs while they did this. Sort of, most of us not paying attention. Those who were paying attention were downplaying it, dismissing it, etc. They've captured the campuses, right? Um, to recapture them, we need to begin producing scholars who are doing the scholarship. So that's what ICSA is about. This is what my institute is about. It's to begin the long game, to promote the scholarship, which is to incentivize people to do this scholarship, but also protect them, right? If you're the only person on your campus who's a Zionist, it's not easy to do anti-Zionist scholarship, right? You're all alone out there, just out there in the wind. But if you're part of an institute and there's a whole support network, I have, by the way, I just hit 100 people, 100 scholars on my roster, right? So there's a lot of interest in this. If you're part of a network and you can go to regular conferences with people who think like you, right? It empowers you. And I'm actively reaching out, by the way, to Jewish graduate students because not only does the other side, the faculty, control the contemporary discourse, but it's almost impossible now to be a graduate student in so many disciplines and be a Zionist. It's like it's the kiss of death to your career. So they've emptied out the pipelines, the whole next generation of faculty. There's not going to be many Zionists among them. So we need to refill that pipeline. So this is what ICSA is doing. It's a long-term game. It's a losing game to try to get rid of a tenured professor. Sometimes they just cross such an abrasive, like when they openly call for the death of their own students, right? Okay, you can maybe get them on something like that, but most of them are careful enough to just be anti-Zionist, not be Semites, because of the distinctions we've made. So I don't think it's worth investing efforts in trying to remove active tenured professors. But what we can do is expose anti-Zionism for the hateful ideology it is, to make it shameful to be an anti-Zionist in the same way, at least officially, it's shameful to be an anti-Semite, right? Nobody wants to openly be an anti-Semite on a college campus. So we need to make anti-Zionism as shameful. And that's how we will put the pressure on anti-Zionist faculty to tone it down and give it up, and open space for people to openly be Zionists and feel safer being Zionists again. So it's not a happy answer. I'd love to, be able to just fire all the people that I don't like, but that's just not feasible or realistic. So I'm beginning the long game, and it will take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, to produce scholars. And my hope is once I have ICSA will be affiliated with a university that's in discussion right now, but it can then be replicated at other universities, right? So I want to establish a beachhead and then basically multiply like spores or something like that. But that's the only solution I can see. It's a long game. It's a long game. Yeah.
Awesome. That's amazing, and we look forward to seeing the continued growth of your institute. So a couple of people asked I know this wasn't the topic of your talk tonight, but instead of focusing on anti-Semitism, why don't we emphasize the spread of radical Islam and the tolerance of the world of it?
So let's close on that question because I see we're getting over time now. That is another great question, and there's at least one good reason why that hasn't happened to this point, and that's because of the DEI industry. It is you're not allowed to be critical of Muslims on campuses. They're seen as a marginalized people of color, oppressed group, and you're not allowed to attack them. Um, so it's pretty clear if any of you have studied this issue, uh, um, that the how should I put this? Islamic anti-Semitism, just the traditional form, and I mentioned earlier, right? Religious Jew hatred. It goes back to the very beginning of Christianity. It goes back to the very beginning of Islam, and it needs to be understood that a significant portion of the hatred that Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims feel towards Israel pre existed prior to anything Israel did, even before Israel existed. In other words, today's campus advocates think we need to fight Israel because the Palestinians have all these grievances. Israel has done all these terrible things, and that's why the Palestinians hate the Israelis because of all these terrible things, and that's why we hate them. But when you actually study the long history of Islamic anti-Semitism, what you realize is there's a very powerful tradition in Islam to truly, truly hate the Jews. Um, and so, therefore, anything the Jews do is evil. And therefore, as Zionism got underway, even though Jews were, draining the swamps and irrigating the deserts and creating economic opportunities and actually building hospitals that were helping the local Arab population, like many of the things the Zionists were doing were benefiting the local population at the time. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the Zionists through the lens of this Islamic Jew hatred. All you see are these are the evil Jews who are trying to take over the world, right? And so you have this pre-existing Islamic anti-Semitism. Basically, the Nazis and the Soviets then introduced the protocols of the Elders of Zion into the Arabic world. So they fused this Islamic Jew hatred with this conspiratorial anti-Semitism from the protocols, and that creates this toxic brew of violent hatred where I am not exaggerating when I say the Palestinian and Muslim leaders basically think Jews are, since the 7th century, are the major threat to Islam and must be annihilated, otherwise they'll destroy Islam. This is the way many, many of them think, and therefore Israel is, of course, going to be the little Satan, as they call it, compared to the West. But it will be a Satan. Doesn't matter how good Israel is. Doesn't matter. They want to share the land. They want to share benefits. They want to, drive Gazans to the hospital, etc. If you look at Jews through this lens, you only see evil, and so it's imperative that this be understood. And so another significant segment of my institute will be devoted to understanding Islamic Jew hatred. You actually have all three forms. You have Islamic Jew, um, uh, anti-Judaism, Islamic anti-Semitism, and Islamic anti-Zionism. And when you look at them together in the proper context of this long history, you realize that the anti-Zionism, which is all over the Arab and Muslim world, isn't ultimately based in grievances against Israeli crimes or anything like that. It comes from something much deeper, and in fact, something any Western progressive allegedly rejects. It comes from racism and hatred and prejudice and bigotry, right? These are things that the Western progressives allegedly hate, and yet somehow they don't understand that the hostility to Israel is exactly the thing that they hate. That's what ICSA needs to, that's what the scholarship needs to do. People have been afraid to say that. They've been afraid to do the scholarship. They've been silent, but no more. It's an emergency. So all hands on deck. If you know any scholars out there, if you're a scholar, please reach out to me. Any collaborator, any supporter. I have a fiscal sponsor, so I'll be able to take money very, very soon. And we'll need money because we need to pay scholars to do this scholarship. So the answer to your question is people haven't done it because they've been afraid and it's politically incorrect, but ICS is going to try to change that.
That's amazing, Dr. Pessin. I'm really pleased to hear that you are talking about this problem of radical Islam because it's the elephant in the room that I would argue the establishment Jewish organizations, these big legacy groups like the ADLs or the Jewish Federations of North
Afraid to
America,
touch it.
they're afraid to touch it because they don't want to be called Islamophobic. And that's why
Right.
grassroots initiatives like ours, including the work of Rhode Island Coalition for Israel, is so important because we are bringing up these topics to all Rhode Islanders and to churches, to synagogues,
Right.
speaking about it with politicians because we actually have been monitoring the activities and the sermons that are posted weekly of the Islamic Center of Rhode Island, which is the
Right
biggest
here in
mosque
Providence,
here.
right. And it's
Right.
horrific what is being preached there on a literally weekly basis. We need to kill the Jews, right? This is just in our neighborhoods,
Exactly.
and it's probably in some mosques near you, right?
Yes, I think it's happening all over the country and all over the Western world. So I'm happy that we're on the same page of having these conversations and taking action and doing something about it. If you don't mind, I would love you to end on just this last question, which I think
All right.
also just really encompasses our work as well and one of our goals. And that is, can you tie the study of anti-Zionism to anti-American values?
Yes. That's another whole webinar. So these are great questions, anti-American values. Um, let me just say very briefly, I do absolutely believe that the attack on the Jews on campuses is not just an attack on the Jews. It's certainly an attack on the academy and by university. And what I mean by that is the quote unquote scholarship that drives anti-Zionism on campus is ultimately no different from the Nazi scholarship that justified the Holocaust. In fact, it's a wonderful book called Hitler's Professors, written by Max Weinreich in the late 1940s, right after the Holocaust. And what he documented was the role that the professors, the PhDs, the scholars played in developing the ideology that justified the final solution, right? And when we look at that, we see so clearly these are people that are so gripped by Jew hatred that they will twist and corrupt their scholarship to find a way to justify ultimately annihilating the Jews. I firmly believe so what we see is that's weaponizing or politicizing scholarship to defend your political aim, which is of course not what true scholarship is. Scholarship that is aims to get at the truth, it aims to be an objective. It shouldn't have a political aim, pure scholarship, right? So we see in the Nazi case how that happened. We see the same thing in the Soviet case. So the Soviet Union literally set up institutions, universities, and some of the names are almost comical. I don't know if I can give you specific names, but they called themselves institutes of Zionology. They were studying Zionism, and their job was to produce what we would call propaganda, delegitimizing Israel and delegitimizing the Jews. But this was being produced by universities, by professors, etc. And indeed, the current president of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, who is now in like the 22nd year of his 4-year term, he got a PhD at a Moscow university writing a Holocaust denying thesis, right? So one of these universities literally that pumped him out, and he's now in charge of the Palestinian Authority, right? So what we see in these two cases, the Nazis and the Islamists, is how the professors produce this corrupted scholarship to advance this political agenda, the political agenda being basically annihilate the Jews. I firmly believe, and I can document this, and this is what Ix is doing, that the large majority of anti-Zionist scholarship today, these professors, these tenured professors they're producing, is literally no different from the Nazi institutes and the Soviet institutes. So if we had Hitler's professors and then Brezhnev's professors for the Soviets, today they're Hamas's professors. They are literally churning out the scholarship that justifies and defends Hamas. And I told you, a 15 lecture series at Connecticut College that amounts to 15 PhDs coming in and explaining why Hamas is a freedom fighting liberation group, and Israel is the genocidal entity, etc. Right? So, the attack on the Jews is an attack on the academy. It's an attack on the norms of the academy, and then finally, it's an attack on fundamental Western values. Fundamental Western values include not just sort of liberal values of pluralism, diversity, tolerance, etc., but they include, especially America, that wasn't just Western, it was American, right? The American dream is that individuals through education could succeed and that we should support that endeavor. But this DEI/critical race theory ideology that exists in this very extreme form today sees success as evil. If you become successful, you become an oppressor, and therefore they see it's not just that the Jews are uber oppressors, it's that success itself is something evil. And indeed, the only way to correct racism is with the only way to correct racism is with more racism in the opposite direction. And so that whole political ideology is completely against individual liberties. It's certainly against the free. They're very anti-capitalist. That's a whole separate conversation, right? It's because they're actually coming out of Marxism, this whole movement. But they're anti-individual liberty, they're anti-capitalism, they're actually anti-pluralism, diversity, and tolerance, although they say that they're in favor of these things. And the best sign of that is they will tolerate no dissent from their orthodoxy. Right? You have to believe exactly what they believe. Otherwise, your speech is harmful and you have to be silenced. That is anti-American, right? They openly deny free speech, by the way, because free speech privileges or prioritizes the powerful person, right? Elon Musk has much more free speech reach than you and I do because he owns Twitter and a million other things, right? And so the free speech is an advantage to those already in power. And so what you need to do is limit the speech of those in power and advance the speech of those not in power. But that's not liberalism and that's not free speech, right? It's actually careful, controlled regulation of speech. So it's anti-American, at least traditional anti-American values. And they're clear about that. They openly say, we need to destroy Israel, we need to destroy America. Like most of the Western progressives, and certainly the Islamists who are part of these movements, we need to destroy the great Satan. So anti-Jews, anti-Academy, anti-America, anti-West, it's all just one big package. And this is what's dominant, unfortunately, on too many of our major campuses.
Right. I definitely agree. And I think the more that we can spread that message and frame it as anti-American, the more people we can bring into our movement. So
Yeah.
on that note, thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you,
Pessin.
everybody.
The
And
fabulous presentation and
give some
discussion.
money to RICI. Give a few dollars to RICI. They do a lot of great work and they need to keep going and expand.
Thank you so much. I did put a link to our website and that PayPal link. If anyone does feel compelled to support our work, it would really mean a lot to us and go a long way. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you, Dr. Pessin, and
Always a
watching you
pleasure.
shine. Thank you so much.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.